Now, as we learn about Malcolm, we're going to learn about him in phases. And you'll be able to identify the phase the moment you see the name change. And so, with that being said, we're going to go ahead and underline Malcolm Little. And this will be his birth name. And this will cover the phase of his birth up until about the 8th grade. Now, he was born May 19th, 1925, to Earl and Louise Little. Now, Earl was a traveling preacher, and that's how he made his bones, provided for his family. He believed that in the teachings of Marcus Garvey, that the black man should be self-sufficient, the black man should be self-educated, that the black man should try to own and operate and control his own labor, control his own family, and he did everything within his power to do so. He eventually marries Louise, and they begin starting a family. And Louise was wanting, at least Malcolm presented it as such, Louise wanted to marry Earl almost because of how dark complected his skin was. Louise was incredibly fair skinned, light complected. She was almost white passing, and she was bothered by that. She felt not betrayed by it, but just embarrassed to know, insulted or hurt to know that the reason for her light complexion probably most likely stemmed from the fact that someone along her family line was sexually assaulted during a period of slavery. If at any point in time you did see anyone of light complexion, you can't go to Africa and find someone naturally born light complected. More often than not, they're mostly are of a darker complexion. You're not going to see this close to white, semi-white passing complexion unless you have had relations with somebody who happens to also be white. Now, you got to imagine it's during a time of slavery, so most of these relationships were not consensual. This is a result of it's sexual assault and rape. And she was disgusted the fact that her children or that light complexion would carry on to her children. So she married someone who was incredibly dark in the hopes that the kids would turn out a bit darker. They were both students of Marcus Garvey. They were very supportive of his message of black pride and black independence, and that they were temporarily in the States, but their ultimate goal was to go back to Africa where they would be respected for the people that they were and the people that they wanted to be. They knew that this was not a place in the United States, that the United States was probably not a place where they would ever be appreciated or respected on equal terms with white America. Nonetheless, they operated to the best of their ability. As I've stated before, Earl had his own farm, and he fed his family with that farm. He was an outspoken Garveyite, and he would take Malcolm to meetings. So Malcolm learned to be proud of being black, proud of black history, proud to see his dad hold audience or hold court for individuals who wanted to hear him speak. And that was impressive. That his mom was educated, that she wrote for the Garvey newspaper to express the ideas, espouse the ideas of Garveyism to the United States, the notion of Pan-Africanism to the United States, so that they could all be better educated and understand ultimately the better route for them to proceed. When I say them, I'm talking about African Americans. Now, due to his outspoken nature, Malcolm's dad will end up being murdered. He's going to be bludgeoned, hit in the back of his head. His body is going to be placed over railroad tracks and ran over. The police will identify this episode or this incident as a suicide. Now, because it's identified as a suicide, Louise is unable to execute the life insurance policy that Earl had established for her and the family. Now, what that should tell you right there, let's go ahead and pause, because it's the 1920s, early 1930s. We're in the midst of the Great Depression, and Earl had the perspective. He had the thought to say to himself, this is going to be an investment that will protect and benefit my family. To be a black man at that time and to have that headspace is impressive. And it just goes to show how much of a pragmatic thinker Earl was, how calculated Earl was, knowing that he had to safeguard his family one way or the other in a country that placed, not directly, but being black in America, the potential of not living long was high. And so he ends up losing his life early. They can't secure that money to provide for the family. She's struggling to make ends meet while raising multiple children. And it seems a bit hectic. Ultimately, she ends up in a mental hospital / home. She's going to be admitted to a mental institute. The children are going to be parceled out into foster care, foster homes. And Malcolm would make analogies to how African slaves were separated from their parents. The mother separated from the children, the husband separated from the wife, and sold out to separate families, and never understanding their heritage, never understanding what their family unit was supposed to be like. And it's now the 1930s, and Malcolm is going, and his family are going through a similar process. What I want you to take away from Malcolm Little is that as a young man, he was taught and he respected the notion that to be black was beautiful, and that you should be proud of being black, and that there's a heritage and there's a history associated with that. With that being said, we move on to Malcolm's next phase of life, and that would be Malcolm known as Red the Hustler. While Malcolm was in foster care, he had the opportunity to attend schools, and he went to practically all white schools. There are so many photos of Malcolm as a young man, and one that stood out to me the most was the school photo. And he's the only black boy in the class for the most part. And despite being different and perceived as a mascot of sort or a pet, he was liked. People liked Malcolm. Malcolm was outgoing, and he had friends, and he was smart, and he did well in class. So much so that he was nominated to be class president. His teachers liked him. His teacher in particular often wondered, Malcolm, what do you want to be when you grow up? And Malcolm would say, I'd like to be a lawyer. And the teacher would respond, well, let's be realistic, Malcolm. We all like you. But being a lawyer is not a realistic goal when you're black. So let's try to be realistic and think about what you can do. You're really good with your hands, Malcolm. You should think about being a carpenter. I think a lot of people would hire you if you were willing to work with your hands. And hey, Jesus was a carpenter. And, Malcolm is taking this in. It sounds like encouragement, but at the same time, it's very defeating, and it definitely bursts his bubble of what he thought he could be. And ultimately realizing that you have these well-intentioned white people supposedly trying to help me. You have these well-intentioned white Christians who are trying to help me, when you had bad Christians kill my father. It was believed by Malcolm and other members of the family that their father, Earl, was killed by the local Ku Klux Klan. And there were many chapters up north, and that because of Earl's outspokenness, they wanted to shut him up, and that's ultimately how that concluded. But Malcolm became disenchanted with what was available to him. While visiting his cousin in Boston, Malcolm became enamored with the bright lights, the limelight, and the underbelly of society. Malcolm saw poor whites, uneducated whites, making money hand over fist, but they had to do so in illegal ways or in a criminal activity. And so Malcolm thought to himself, well, if they're doing this, I should be able to do that. If they're not going to be able to let me read books and determine my path in life by way of education, well, I'm going to do it by way of criminal activity. So he goes by the name in this phase of his life, Red the Hustler. And this is Malcolm engaging in criminal activity because to a degree this is the only way he knows how to be white. That I'm already light complected, so I can get away a little bit here. They're going to call me red because my hair has a red tinge to it, and I'm going to go ahead and conk it, which is like relax it or perm it, and it's going to lay down flat. I'll be able to run a comb through it, and it's going to look slicked back a bit, and I'm almost going to look somewhat white. And then hopefully that allows me to sell drugs. It's going to allow me to sell women. It's going to allow me to run numbers. And that was an old school way of illegal gambling back in the day, was running numbers. And Malcolm's engaged in this life where he doesn't like being black. I mean, when has black ever benefited him? You go look at his black mom, you go look at it, who's now institutionalized. You go look at his black dad, who has now been murdered. You look at Christians who had did it. He hates Christianity. He hates everything that it's ironic. It's almost he did a 180 from what he was as, or who he was as Malcolm Little, and now as Red the Hustler. All he wants to be is white. He gets strung out on cocaine. He's going to get busted for burglary and then ultimately sentenced to prison. And while in prison, he's going to be known as the devil because of the disdain he has for Christianity. Now, while in prison, Malcolm will become aware of an organization known as the Nation of Islam. Let's go ahead and underline that. The Nation of Islam will be referred to or identified by Orthodox Muslims, Sunni or Shia, that this is an occult of sorts. This isn't a true form of Islam. And it was founded by the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. And honorable is questionable, but that's the title he ultimately went by, and was often referred to as the messenger to Allah or of Allah. And that Allah had given Elijah Muhammad the message to deliver to the 40 million so-called Negroes living in the United States. A message of re-education, a message that was going to uplift them, provide them with a pathway to be on Allah's side, not on the white man's side. That there's no need or desire to be around white men because white men were never going to benefit you. If anything, to be amongst white men was to be upon a sinking ship. Malcolm hears this and he goes, what are you talking about? This sounds crazy. But the more and more he heard the stories, or the more and more he heard the teachings, and the more and more the Honorable Elijah wrote to Malcolm while in prison, Malcolm began to realize, man, some of this stuff does make a bit of sense. Malcolm began to realize, when have I ever encountered a white person, well-intentioned or ill-intentioned? When have they ever benefited me? Where have white people gone and not caused havoc? Malcolm even learned by way of the Nation of Islam that even when they opened their book, as they profess to be adherents to the Bible, and it says, in the beginning there was darkness. And that darkness is a representation of God, and that God is black, God is dark. In the Bible, it's often written in parables, and things are presented as such, even though they may not be. For example, in the Garden of Eden, there's the serpent, and the serpent is a representation of Satan or sin. And but it's not really that. That's not really the case. There wasn't a real serpent in this particular case. There was no real darkness. Darkness was God. And in the beginning, there was God. And then God created all things afterwards. God created man in his image. That means the first man was black. The first woman was black. And all creations thereafter would be black, with the sole exception of this adulterated version of man, this genetic deformity of man, and that would be the white man. And you might ask yourself, well, how in the world is that possible? And how could you even argue and articulate what appears to, they almost sound kind of racist. Well, the argument is very simple. And the Nation of Islam and the Honorable Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X would ultimately learn this is not difficult to discern. You just open up your own biology books, which aren't written by black people. They're not written by people of color. You go open up the European biology book, the American biology book, and you'll see that they talk about the notion of genetic traits and that there are dominant traits and there are recessive traits. Well, what does it mean to be dominant? That means that it's overwhelmingly present. It's powerful. It's strong. It's prominent. It takes place over recessive. Now, what is recessive? Recessive is weak. It's an anomaly. It's a hairline of sorts. And it's not strong. It's less than. And so what are examples or what's evidence of dominant traits when you look at a human? Well, if you look at their skin, it's darker skin. If you look at their hair, it's darker hair. If you look at their eyes, it's darker eyes. What are recessive traits for a human? That would be a blonde-haired, blue-eyed, white devil, as the Nation of Islam would call them, that they were these dusty, pasty devils that were the scorn of earth, that they were the infected version of what true man was supposed to be under a true faith, which is Islam, under a true God, which is Allah. And as Malcolm is learning this starts to make a lot of sense to him. It just based off of pure logic, he's thinking to himself, now wait a minute, you mean to tell me there was a man named Hitler who had convinced and mesmerized millions of people in Germany and in other places around the world that a superior race could exist and that it was going to be a blonde-haired, blue-eyed individual? And that doesn't make any sense according to your own books, whether they be scientific books, whether they be religious books. And so the Nation of Islam incorporated this pseudo-scientific religious philosophy, and it was attractive to what the black man in America and the black woman in America were experiencing. So it was definitely attractive. Malcolm joins this organization and begins to start loving who he is. He loves who he is so much so that anything that's antithetical to who he is, he's thinking, well, then I couldn't love that because that's not me. And then he finds out what's antithetical to being a black Muslim in America. He begins to despise white American Christians. Not because of their state, but because of their actions while in that state. And that leads us to Malcolm X. And we're not going to underline it just yet, but while in prison, Malcolm ultimately submits to Allah, submits to the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, and becomes a fruitful member to the Nation of Islam. He renounces his slave name, which is Malcolm Little. You can't go to Africa and find the Little tribe. You can't go to Africa and find the Jones or the Jackson tribe. You can't go to Africa and find the Washington tribe. Those are slave names that were placed upon slaves as examples of ownership, as one would do to denote property. Malcolm says, I don't belong to the last name Little. And he is given the X, which in mathematics represents the unknown. And until he is given his name by the messenger or by Allah, usually, Elijah Muhammad would deliver the name to an individual if Allah sees it as such. Until then, Malcolm will go by Malcolm X. And Malcolm studies the faith, and Malcolm earns the praise of Elijah Muhammad, who declares Malcolm as the national spokesperson for the Nation of Islam. If you look at science today, or if you look at astronomy today, as people, try to understand the Earth, the planets, the moons, the stars, the galaxies, the universe, and with the telescopes and the what NASA's doing, what other countries are doing, and guess what we've discovered? We discovered that 5% of the Earth is what we really know, and that 95% we don't know. But what do we know? We're going to refer to all the things we can't understand. We're going to call that dark matter. Let me repeat that. We're going to call that dark matter. And then we have to ask ourselves, well, why? Dark matter. The things we don't know, that God created the heavens and the earth and the universe around us, that we know 5% of it, so-called, according to scientists, according to the learned community, that 95% we're just going to label dark matter. And then dark, if you're in the Nation of Islam, you would just simply identify that as, well, that's always been the case, because God has always mattered, and God is dark. God is black. And you should be thankful for that. Now, as Malcolm enters and becomes the national spokesperson for the Nation of Islam, he will be identified as Minister Malcolm X. Now, let's go ahead and underline that name. This is phase 3 of Malcolm's evolutionary and revolutionary life. Minister Malcolm preached a message of re-education, that the black man in America has been taught to be passive, has been taught to be docile, has been taught to hate who they are, to hate where they come from, to hate themselves, and that the so-called Negro in America, and even like, who in the world would call you Negro? Why in the world would you be called Negro? That makes no sense. And then you have the audacity to hear people say, well, it's because in Latin, Negro means black. Oh, okay. Well, then how come we don't refer to white people in Latin? How come we don't refer to Asian people in Latin? You call them white. You don't call them blanco. You don't call them amarillo. You don't, or whatever it's called in Latin. But for some strange reason, you want to refer to only black people and use this Latin designation. And the Nation of Islam would make the argument that's because the word that's closely associated with Negro is the word necro, and necro in Latin means death. Because that's exactly how they see black people. Dumb, deaf, dead, and blind. Dead, walking zombies in America. But that doesn't always have to be the case. If you truly understand who God is, if you truly understand what the design of Islam has for the so-called Negro in America, if you truly understand your history, you'll learn to love who you are, love your culture, love your heritage. And oftentimes, that because you love yourself so much so, people take that as, well, that means you don't love me. And that may not necessarily be the case. But see, that is the ego, or that's the arrogance of an individual, to gaslight you into thinking that by your expression of love for your community, you must hate me. And Malcolm at times would get caught in that rhetoric, and would often make reference to the notion that, it's not that he hates white people. He hates oppression. He hates discrimination. He hates racism. He hates what you do because whiteness allows you to engage in that activity. And at the end of the day, as far as he was concerned, he doesn't want to interact or be around whites. If anything, Malcolm would preach a message that the Nation of Islam would ask him to preach. And remember, because simply he's a spokesperson. So everything he would say would always start off by saying, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad teaches us so-and-so. The Honorable Elijah Muhammad teaches us thus and thus. Because he's in essence just an echo, if you will, an extension, if you will, of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. And as far as they were concerned, we're only going to preach separation. We don't want to integrate with white America. What would be the benefit of that? If you think that God is going to deliver your people from the evils of society, well, why in the world would you aboard or integrate an evil ship? It makes no sense. So, we don't need to integrate one bit. If we need a store, we'll make a store. And they did. The Nation of Islam had multiple stores. They had multiple temples. They had multiple schools. Schools for children to learn. Schools for women to learn. Schools for men to learn self-defense. The Nation of Islam taught young black men to defend themselves, to defend their women, to defend their children, to defend their faith, to be educated, to stand up for themselves, to be morally upright, that they weren't to be gambling, they weren't to be sinning, they were not to be engaged in fornication, that they were not going to engage in gambling, they were not going to drink, they were not going to smoke, they were not going to curse. They would deprive them of all the things that white America has placed in front of them for them to trip up on. So then you can't hold that stick over a young black Muslim. You can't do it. The young black Muslim is so dedicated and educated and in line with what is necessary in order to please Allah, there's no way in the world that they would give in to the temptations that white American Christians are placing in front of them. Now, eventually, over time, Malcolm actively preached self-defense against the violence of racism. Malcolm did not preach violence. And that's I think a common misconception associated with the comparison to Dr. King, in that if Dr. King preaches nonviolence and Malcolm is the opposite of Dr. King, well then Malcolm must be preaching violence. And that's not true one bit. Malcolm did not preach violence. He preached self-defense, and that there's no reason for me to defend myself or engage in violence if you're not already transgressing against me. Malcolm preached self-defense against physical violence, against political violence, against economic violence, and we see that racism is the instrument by which to execute that form of violence. Malcolm often made fun of Dr. King. Malcolm often disagreed with Dr. King. Malcolm said some fairly inflammatory stuff about Dr. King. But this was all at the understanding and behest of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad while being the national spokesperson for the Nation of Islam. And eventually, Malcolm will have a falling out with Elijah Muhammad and is ousted from the Nation of Islam due to Malcolm's understanding and discovery of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad's inappropriate relationships and activities with members within the community. When Malcolm leaves the Nation of Islam, he decides to make that sacred pilgrimage to Mecca. As a Muslim who is able to make that pilgrimage and travel to Mecca and make the 7 circuits, he will inherit a new name, and that name is El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz. El-Hajj is a title that is given to any Muslim that has the ability to make the sacred pilgrimage to Mecca. Malik is his name that he will go by as he's traveling abroad, and El-Shabazz is in relation to the tribe that he belongs to, that he has identified with. And the Honorable Elijah Muhammad didn't give this to him, as he is separated from the Nation of Islam at the time. But one thing is true: while Malcolm was abroad, he sees fellow Muslims on this pilgrimage, and he sees that these followers of the faith are of different types of communities. They are different colors. He saw a Muslim with the blondest of blonde hair. He saw a Muslim with the bluest of blue eyes and the whitest of white skin. And in the Nation of Islam, he was taught by the Honorable Elijah Muhammad that it was impossible for a white person to be a Muslim, because Islam is a religion of peace and white people do not know peace. So when Malcolm discovered, if you will, or was exposed to white Muslims, it definitely shattered the myth that he created regarding the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. It broke the myth he had regarding the teachings and philosophy of the Nation of Islam. Not individually, not that it should be thrown away entirely, but there were elements of the Nation of Islam that were obviously misguided, incorrect, and Malcolm was not going to stand for that. Malcolm is going to leave Mecca. He's going to leave Africa. He's going to leave Europe. He's going to leave the Middle East, but not before embracing Islam as a religion of peace and love that knows no color or racism. Malcolm becomes inspired. He rejects racism and embraces a slogan, "by any means necessary," as a call of action to unite all people in his effort to rid America, as he realizes that the problem is in the United States and that the problem is the capitalist Christian American who who believes that they are superior by way of their race, and that racism, again, is nothing more than an instrument by which to keep people down, that capitalism is an instrument by which to keep people down, and that these divisions and even Christianity is being utilized as an instrument to keep people down, and that Malcolm sees that the only way that we're going to be able to free ourselves of this racist underbelly in America is if we begin to realize and take a strategy that is willing to accept any and all approaches that are sincerely designed to bring about a solution that benefits the marginalized communities in America.